Staff Sergeant Jamal Rivers stepped off the plane, the weight of a deployment still clinging to his shoulders like desert dust. He walked through the busy Atlanta airport, his Army service uniform immaculate, nameplate shining, medals aligned, every crease speaking of duty and discipline. The duffel bag at his side wasn't just filled with clothes. It carried memories of comrades, of nights without sleep, of sandstorms and silence after gunfire. He wasn't just coming home. He was carrying the unseen cost of freedom. His heart beat with a quiet urgency, not from fear, but from hope. He was here to surprise his mother, the woman who had written him letters through every tour, who had cried quietly each time he left and prayed loudly every time he came back. She didn't know he was coming. He wanted to see her face light up when she opened the door. He wanted, for once, to be the joy walking through her threshold instead of just a voice crackling over the phone. But the airport didn't welcome him like a hero. It didn't embrace him as a protector of the nation. Instead, it watched him with narrowed eyes, as if he had carried back not just sand and fatigue, but suspicion. A white woman clutched her purse a little tighter as he walked by. 2 TSA agents stared too long, whispering. The air was thick with an unspoken accusation. He had worn the uniform long enough to know the difference between admiration and fear, and this was not admiration. Jamal had faced this before, the disbelief that a black man in uniform could be anything but a costume. He'd learned to breathe through it, to hold his ground without raising his voice, to be calm even when the world wasn't. But today, there was something colder in the air, something heavier. He adjusted his duffel bag, glanced at his phone, waiting for a message from the friend coming to pick him up. And then, from behind him, came the sharp voice of authority. Not the voice of respect, but one sharpened by assumption. "Hey, you. Stop right there." Jamal froze. Years of training pulsed through his muscles. He turned slowly, hands visible, posture calm. 2 white police officers strode toward him, one hand already resting near his holster, the other with eyes that didn't see a soldier, only a suspect. Jamal didn't flinch. He had stood in war zones where real bullets flew. But here, in the country he served, the war looked different. It wore a badge and carried prejudice like a second weapon. And just like that, the homecoming turned into something else entirely. Not a moment of reunion, but the beginning of a trial. Not for anything he had done, but for everything he represented. A black man in a place of honor, in a country still struggling to see him as its own. The gleam of Jamal's uniform should have spoken for itself. The polished brass, the precise fold of fabric, the weight of years worn on his chest. But in the eyes of officers Ryan Beckett and Luke Haynes, none of it mattered. To them, it wasn't a symbol of honor. It was a disguise. A lie. A threat wrapped in cloth they believed didn't belong to him. Beckett's voice was gruff, coated in a kind of arrogance that came not from truth, but from unchecked authority. Haynes, colder, sharper, stared at Jamal as if already certain of his guilt. "We got a report of a stolen military uniform," Beckett sneered, eyes scanning Jamal from boots to collar. "And look at you walking around like it's yours." Jamal's heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from something deeper, that heavy, familiar ache of being unseen. It wasn't the first time someone questioned his right to wear the uniform. But this time, it wasn't a glance or a whisper. It was open, hostile, and public. He squared his shoulders and looked the officers in the eyes. "I earned this," he said, each word deliberate, steady like a drumbeat in his chest. But they didn't want his words. They wanted submission. Haynes stepped in closer, voice low and biting. "Open your bag. Now." Jamal didn't flinch. "Unless you have probable cause, I don't have to show you anything," he said calmly, though his fists ached from clenching. Around them, the airport had begun to change. Travelers slowed, eyes drawn to the scene. Some whispered, others filmed, unsure of what they were witnessing but sensing something was wrong. The word boy landed like a slap. Jamal heard it, felt it, the centuries of contempt packed into a single syllable. But still he stood his ground. "I'm not a boy," he said, voice steady. "I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Army." But titles meant nothing when your skin wrote your story before your mouth could. The officers didn't blink. They grabbed him, forced his arms behind his back, the steel of the cuffs cold and humiliating. His duffel bag hit the ground, contents spilling, ID, military documents, even the ceremonial blues folded with care. Beckett looked down and sneered. Fake. The crowd gasped. A child clutched his mother's hand, eyes wide with confusion. Phones recorded. A voice in the crowd shouted, "That's racial profiling." But the cops didn't care. They were writing a story with their hands and their power, one where Jamal was a criminal first, a soldier second, if ever at all. Jamal's voice cracked the tension like thunder. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Beckett rolled his eyes.
"Yeah."
"You're a fraud." But the tide was shifting. Justice doesn't always arrive in time, but sometimes it walks in just when it's needed most, in the form of Captain Andre Maxwell, whose voice thundered through the terminal like judgment itself. "Unhand that soldier." And in that moment, not when Jamal stepped off the plane, not when he stood tall in uniform, not even when he was humiliated, but right then, when someone in power finally saw him and believed him, suspicion began to crack. Just a little. Just enough. They removed the cuffs, but the sting remained. Not in the wrists, those marks would fade, but somewhere deeper in a place that uniforms and medals could not protect. Jamal stood still, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the floor as Captain Maxwell confronted the officers. The crowd around them began to thin, the spectacle over, but the wound it left was just beginning to bleed. Captain Maxwell's voice was fire held in steel. "You detained a decorated soldier, without cause. You humiliated him, on camera, in front of civilians, without even running a proper check." His tone was quiet, lethal, the kind of fury that came not from rage but from disappointment honed into principle. Beckett stammered. Haynes stayed silent. Cowards often do, when the light finally turns on. But Jamal didn't speak. Not yet. There was something sacred in the silence he held, like the last quiet moment before a storm. Later, in a sterile back office lined with TSA posters and unused printers, Jamal sat across from Maxwell. The older man had removed his cap, revealing a crown of silver hair cut close to the scalp. His voice was lower now, but not gentler. "They'll file a report," he said. "The footage will help. But if you don't press charges or make a statement, this gets swept under." Jamal's fingers curled over the brim of his own cap, worn and sweat-stained, still trembling from what had almost happened. "I've dealt with worse," he muttered. Maxwell leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I know you have. We all have. But being used to something doesn't make it right. Endurance is strength, but silence gives them room to repeat it." Those words sat heavy in the air, like a choice that had always been there but only now demanded to be faced. Jamal thought of his grandfather, who fought in Korea and came home to separate water fountains. Thought of his uncle, who wore a badge and still got pulled over in his own neighborhood. Thought of the medals he'd earned in Kandahar, Mosul, and Fallujah, none of which had shielded him from suspicion in his own country. Then he thought of the boy at the airport, the one holding his mother's hand, watching everything with eyes too young to understand but old enough to remember. That boy didn't need to see another man swallowed by silence. "I'm not staying quiet," Jamal said, finally, his voice a slow burn rising from the ashes. "They're going to remember my name, and not because of a mugshot." Captain Maxwell nodded once. There was no smile, only a solemn kind of approval. The kind old warriors reserve for those who've chosen a harder road. The next day, Jamal stood before cameras, not as a victim, but as a soldier reclaiming his dignity. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. He told the truth, plainly, with the power of someone who had earned the right to be believed. He told America what it looked like to wear its uniform and still not be trusted. He spoke for those who couldn't, for those too tired, for those who never got the chance. And when the interview ended and the lights dimmed, Jamal didn't feel lighter. Justice was not a feather. It was a weight. But it was his to carry now, not as burden, but as proof. Proof that enduring doesn't mean accepting. And silence, no matter how noble, is not always peace. The days that followed moved with the pace of slow justice, deliberate, cold, and sometimes cruel. Jamal's story rippled through the country, carried on headlines and hashtags, dissected by pundits, dismissed by cynics, embraced by the quiet multitudes who saw themselves in his silence, his stare, his refusal to vanish. But beyond the noise, beyond the politics and performance, something else was forming, something harder to see, yet impossible to stop. It began with a letter, handwritten, creased, and smudged, delivered without return address. It read, "You don't know me, but I served in 71. I saw your interview. What you did, what you said, wasn't just brave. It was needed. You didn't stand alone that day. And you won't stand alone now." Then came the others. Emails, calls, packages, folded flags with stories tucked beneath them. A silver cross from a widow in Kansas. A bronze star replica from a former medic in Detroit. A child's crayon drawing of Jamal in uniform, standing like a lighthouse in a storm. No glory, no theatrics, just respect. The kind that comes without cameras. One morning, Jamal opened his door to find an elderly man in a brown suit and a Vietnam hat, standing straight despite the years. He didn't introduce himself. He just saluted. Jamal returned it, and they stood there, 2 generations bound not by war, but by the invisible oath that never expired. Honor one another. Even when the world forgets. In the heart of D.C., a group of retired officers signed a petition demanding reform in how veterans are treated at federal checkpoints. In Atlanta, a young cadet quoted Jamal's speech at her graduation. In L.A., a mural appeared overnight, Jamal's face, weathered and calm, beneath the words, "Respect is not a courtesy. It's a debt." The irony was sharp. They had tried to isolate him, to reduce him to a problem, a security threat, a mistaken identity. But in doing so, they had awakened a brotherhood that didn't require proximity or uniform. A fellowship of the disrespected, the misjudged, the almost forgotten, who recognized in Jamal not just a man wronged, but a man who refused to rot in bitterness. Captain Maxwell returned a week later, this time not in duty blues, but in civilian clothes. He found Jamal seated on a bench outside a local VA center, waiting for nothing in particular, just letting the wind carry the silence for once. Maxwell sat beside him. "They want you to speak at the memorial next month. National stage." Jamal let the words settle. "What do they want me to say?" Maxwell shrugged. "Whatever the truth is." Jamal looked out at the trees swaying in the early light. The scars on his wrists had faded. The ache had not. But he had learned something in that ache. That honor, real honor, is not pristine. It doesn't shine. It bleeds, endures, and stands up again. And it never does so alone. He thought of the letters, the strangers, the salute. Of the boy at the airport who had seen something unspoken. Of the men who came before him, walking a darker road with fewer allies. And of those who had come after, needing to know that someone had once held the line for them, not with bullets, but with truth. Jamal turned to Maxwell. "I'll speak," he said. "But not for them. For us." The sun broke through the clouds then, soft and golden. Not triumphant, just honest. Like everything that mattered. And for the first time in weeks, Jamal smiled, not because the fight was over, but because he knew this. When you carry honor the right way, the weight is never yours alone. The day Jamal stepped onto the marble floor of the Capitol Rotunda, the silence was a different kind. Not the heavy, indifferent silence of suspicion, but the taut stillness of a room on the edge of reckoning. He wore no medals, no ceremonial colors, just a dark gray suit and the calm of a man who had walked through fire and never once screamed. The audience wasn't just composed of senators and generals. There were clerks, janitors, nurses, mailmen, teachers, veterans in plain clothes. People who had followed his story not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. The quiet humiliation. The profiling. The way systems say we're sorry with press releases but not reform. Today, for once, the system couldn't look away. Jamal approached the podium without notes. He didn't need them. He had spent a lifetime preparing for this, not in words, but in restraint, in patience, in dignity forged under pressure. His voice was calm. measured. Every syllable clear as steel tapping glass. I came here today not to relive what happened to me at the bank. You already know. You've seen the footage. You've read the apologies. But I came to say something that matters more than outrage. He paused, eyes locked with the senior officials in the front row. This country taught me how to hold a rifle before it taught me how to hold a checkbook. It trained me to defend a constitution that I wasn't sure would defend me back. And yet I did. With pride. With loyalty. Because I believed in something larger than myself. Someone coughed nervously. Jamal didn't flinch. What happened to me didn't happen because of one teller, one officer, one policy. It happened because systems that claim to protect are trained to doubt people who look like me, speak like me, move like me, grieve like me. And then, when they're wrong, they hope we'll just move on quietly. A hush swept the room. He continued. But here's what they didn't expect. I wasn't alone. I never was. You saw it. Letters. Marches. Grandmothers in Mississippi sending $20 checks to pay for my legal fees. Veterans of every war lining up to say, enough. And suddenly, what happened at that bank wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. And that made it impossible to ignore. He stepped slightly forward. I don't need compensation. I don't want symbolic gestures. I want accountability. I want training that sees human before threat. I want policies that understand service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. I want reform that lives in policy, not PR. A few heads nodded. Others looked down, exposed. And to those who said I should have just walked away, to keep the peace, to not make trouble, I say this. Peace built on silence is not peace. It's surrender. And I will not teach the next generation to surrender. By the time he finished, there was no applause. Not yet. Just that raw stillness, the kind that comes when truth has filled the room and left no place to hide. Later that day, his words were replayed on the floor of Congress. Committees called emergency sessions. 2 banks issued policy overhauls. The Department of Veterans Affairs released a joint statement calling for sweeping reforms in how veterans are processed, identified, and honored across all civilian sectors. A dozen institutions rushed to offer public support, not because it looked good, but because silence now felt like complicity. And as night fell, Jamal returned to the quiet of his porch, watching the stars bleed into a darkening sky. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He simply sat with a quiet kind of justice, one that comes not when the world cheers for you, but when it finally listens. Because once the truth stands in the light, the system can no longer pretend it doesn't see. The official statement came 3 days later. It was brief, measured, unemotional. The bank called it an unfortunate incident and regrettable misunderstanding. They promised internal review, staff retraining, and community outreach. No names were mentioned. No one resigned. No one admitted fault. It was not an apology. It was a containment. Jamal read it once, then folded the letter in half, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it on the mantel next to a framed photograph of his unit in Kandahar, dusty boots, tired grins, eyes that had seen more than they would ever speak of. He stood there for a long moment, not angry, not bitter, just ready. Because what he had to say now wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request for kindness or understanding or institutional grace. It was a line drawn, quiet, firm, and final. They had offered him a chance to meet with the bank executives in private. A gesture, they called it. He declined. Instead, he spoke again, this time not in a rotunda, but at a high school auditorium in the very neighborhood where the incident happened. The seats were full. Young faces. Old faces. Working people. Single mothers. A few police officers sat in the back, arms folded. Jamal didn't use a microphone. His voice didn't need it. I'm not here to forgive, he began, his gaze steady. Not because I'm incapable of forgiveness, but because what happened doesn't need forgiveness. It needs prevention. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. I know what some of you are thinking, that this is just another unfortunate story, that the world is full of mistakes, and this was one of them. But hear me, this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. The mistake was that I didn't walk out quietly like they expected. The mistake was me.
He paused.
Let it settle. What happened to me at that bank is happening in offices, in classrooms, in hospitals, in airports. Everywhere someone's skin, accent, or history makes them a question mark instead of a person. And you think it ends when the cameras leave? You think it's over when a press release says sorry. His voice dropped, but somehow grew sharper. I was silent once. Not because I was afraid, but because I thought dignity meant swallowing the injustice. I know better now. He stepped forward. This isn't a fight for me. It's a warning for you. For anyone watching, listening, nodding politely. The days of quiet endurance are done. You cannot pretend ignorance when the truth has knocked on your door. When it stood in your lobby. When it bled on your sidewalk. A teenager in the front row sat up straighter. I am not here to be your redemption arc. I'm not your teachable moment. I'm not a headline or a trending tag. I'm a man. A citizen. A veteran. And what you see standing before you is not a victim. It's a signal. He looked directly into the camera being live-streamed to thousands now. His words hit like cold thunder. To every system that thinks reputation is more valuable than reform, we are watching. To every executive who believes silence is strategy, we are recording. And to every institution that thinks an apology is enough, we are past apologies. A long silence followed. This time, the applause came late, not out of politeness, but reverence. Something had shifted. Not because he demanded justice, but because he warned what would follow if justice continued to be delayed. This wasn't about closure. It was about consequence. Later that week, other stories surfaced. A veteran in Arizona. A teacher in Brooklyn. A nurse in Atlanta. Each had endured what Jamal had. Each had been quiet until now. And suddenly, the banks weren't just issuing statements. They were reviewing policies. Congressional hearings were being scheduled. Civil rights organizations filed a joint petition demanding federal oversight of discriminatory financial practices. Jamal never smiled at the headlines. He didn't want fame. He didn't want revenge. He wanted institutions to understand this wasn't a rupture. It was a reckoning. And that letter on his mantle? He burned it quietly one night under the stars. Not out of anger, but to make space for what would come next. Because apologies without accountability are just noise. And silence, he had learned, is never neutral. It's a choice. One he no longer made.